This is your Professor Ian. Welcome to my video lecture, the first part, on fallacies, logical fallacies. So let's start by defining what a fallacy is. In brief, it's an argument that relies on faulty or manipulative reasoning. So pretty broad, and we're going to see a number of different ways this can work. It can work on a purely logical level or emotional level. It can work on in a bunch of different ways. That's why I have this broad kind of definition. So in my talk, I'm going to talk about a little bit about fallacies in general, but mostly I'm going to go through what I call my dirty dozen. So 12 big fallacies, I guess you could say. I would encourage you to take a look at this site, yourlogicalfallacyis.com. You can see a bunch of other fallacies that people talk about. People who are into fallacies, have many different ways of talking about fallacies and ways of splitting them up and naming them. Some of these have multiple names. So don't be surprised about that. There's a whole wild, wacky world of fallacies out there on the internet. What you're seeing is a kind of, these are the popular 12 that I've kind of culled from the vast pool of fallacies. Again, if you're interested in this topic, please do spend some time investigating and discover some for yourself. Let me say a couple points to begin with, though. Some fallacies are just bad forms of potentially good arguments. So it's like the classical appeals we've been talking about. There's pathos, which is effective and a good way to emotionally connect with the reader. And then there's pathos that is, overly emotional and is meant to distract the reader. And then we'd call that a fallacy, right? So there's some fallacies. A good example is the slippery slope fallacy. There are good forms of a slippery slope argument, and there are fallacious versions of a slippery slope argument. So, fallacy is just talking about that either intentional or unintentional slip into bad reasoning and bad persuasive techniques. Also, many of these fallacies are combinations, right? You'll see them working together to create an effect. So it's like the appeals themselves, ethos, pathos, and logos. Most of the time when you see logos, there's also some ethos involved. How can you trust facts and figures if there isn't some kind of credibility attached to that, right? So oftentimes these will work in combination and work together. So don't be worried if you look at a fallacy and you're like, well, it kind of looks like this, kind of looks like that, right? We're not here to be super technical. We're looking at fallacies as a way to help us unpack bad reasoning and give it some, get some terminology and some names that we can use to help us, look at these things a little more objectively, hopefully. So let's start with the first one, which is called hasty generalization. So this is when we draw a conclusion or inference from insufficient evidence, right? So in this one, after my son had his vaccine, he developed autism. Therefore, the vaccine caused autism. So based on this scant amount of evidence, this boy had a vaccine and then developed autism, the person is drawing this conclusion. Therefore, the vaccine must have caused this. We could also call this something else, as we'll see later on, but we can call this a hasty generalization. You're drawing a conclusion from insufficient evidence, right? I'm not here to get into the debate about vaccines, but I'm saying this formulation of the argument is insufficient. There's no direct link, there's no proof that the vaccine caused the autism in this statement, right? So this is what we call a hasty generalization, using insufficient evidence to reach a conclusion. Very common kind of fallacy, right? The second one we're going to look at, overly emotional appeal. So again, as I mentioned, there's good pathos you can use to connect to an audience. You can use to form an emotional bond and show the human impact of something. And there's what we call an overly emotional appeal. So using heightened emotion to distract the readers from logical arguments or the lack thereof, right? So using too much emotion, ramping up that emotion to elicit that emotional reaction from the reader or the listener in the hopes that it will distract them from the other parts of the argument, or that it will lead them to make certain decisions based on that emotional reaction rather than a logical engagement with the ideas. Right? You remember the Purina ad that we watched earlier in the semester when we were talking about the appeals? And I pointed out that perhaps that was manipulative, because all they do is show you sad pictures of dogs. And at the end, they say, hey, if you buy our dog food, we'll give money to charity. But they don't tell you how much money, and they don't tell you any of the details. It could be 1 cent per $1 million they sell, right? None of that is actually conveyed in the commercial. Instead, they want you to react to the sad pictures of animals and then be distracted from the logical argument at the end and buy into it in an easier way. There's another side of emotional reactions, and that's scare tactics. So we could put this under the heading of overly emotional appeals, that you exaggerate possible dangers to frighten readers and create support for your arguments. Right? Scare tactics are very common. In this next slide, you can see this is again about vaccines. How many vaccines will your child get? And look at how they're presenting the information. Nobody wants their child to get a whole bunch of needles. That's scary, right? So they list all these different things your child's going to get. They don't, note that some of these are combined, right? At 6 months, a child does not get 7 needles. At least mine didn't. Or 5 at 4 months, right? So none of that is really conveyed here. Instead, you get a whole list of these things. They're trying to scare you by showing you, by making it seem scary. And of course, note the visual display. This giant, a third of the picture is this troubled-looking child. Notice the words in red, right? Notice which ones are, bolded. Too many, right? And then this list of potential diseases. No real connection to any kind of scientific support for any of this. Instead, just a whole bunch of scary sounding words and all these things, all these sound scary, like chemical stuff, right? So very little actual information and a lot of fright being used in this ad. The third fallacy we're going to look at, either or choices, false dilemma. This is when we reduce a complex situation to simplistic either or choices in order to obscure other options, right? So we have a very complicated idea and you say, well, you either think this or you think that. We boil things down, right? So for example, here's a couple examples. Colin Kaepernick must stand during the national anthem or he cannot be considered a patriot, right? So that's often how we see this debate being boiled down. Is it not possible that he likes America and that's why he's trying to do this? That's an argument you could make, right? But when we reduce it to an either or situation, it forces you as the reader or the audience to take one stand or the other. It's like, oh, either. And in this one, of course, it's negative if you agree with Kaepernick. If you agree with Kaepernick, then he's not a patriot, and then you're not patriotic, et cetera, right? So you can see how it's turning a very complex issue into this very black and white either or choice, which isn't fair to the issue being discussed. My second example, either you want to ban assault rifles or you don't care about children being shot, right? There's some people who want to have assault rifles legal and care about children being shot. It's not that black or white. It's not an either or choice. There's a lot of people in the middle, but when you force people to take these stands, these choices, you turn a very complex issue into a black or white choice, and you force your reader or your listener to automatically side with one camp or the other. And it's not a way of addressing very complex issues. It's a way of turning complex issues into an emotional reaction. I side with this or I side with that, and then don't really examine the issue further. And it really takes away from complexity of issues. The fourth one, the slippery slope argument. So these are arguments that depend on a chain of events that end in dire consequences, right? A will lead to B, will lead to C, will lead to D. D is bad. A is not so bad, right? It seems, and then there's a slippery slope down to that D, that bad final consequence, right? So, and this is one of the ones I was giving you an example that are potentially good examples of this. So potentially this could be good. If you allow your children to eat junk food when they are young, they will never develop a taste for healthy food and will end up eating junk food as adults and will be more susceptible to heart disease and diabetes. That's not a bad argument. I need to support that more, but I don't think that's terrible, right? I think we want to encourage children to eat healthy food at a young age so they get, a taste for it and get into that. I'm not saying all children who eat junk food will end up like this, but I'm saying there's a risk. So I think that's a potentially valid argument. Now, I'm going to pause the video here so you can watch a commercial on YouTube. And I want you to ask yourself, in this one, they present a slippery slope argument. Think about what that slippery slope is. What are the steps? What are the A, B, C, D, right? What leads to this, leads to that, leads to this? And then ask yourself if there are clear links between those steps. And we'll take this up after you watch the video.